The glass didn't break when it hit the marble floor. It simply separated, the stem from the base, the bowl from the stem, as if it had decided quietly and without ceremony that it was done holding itself together. The sound it made was small, barely a note, and yet every person in the room heard it, because the room had gone so completely silent that even breathing felt like an interruption. Zola had set the glass down too hard. She knew that. Her hand had been shaking. She had been shaking since the moment Sterling's mother, Vivian Ashford, had looked across the length of the dining room table, past the white peonies, and the crystal water goblets, and the plates that cost more than Zola's first apartment, and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I don't know why you insist on bringing her to these things, Sterling. She doesn't understand what she's walking into." Zola had been sitting right there. She had been sitting right there for 11 years. The Ashford family had a compound in Westport, Connecticut, which they referred to simply as the property, in the way that very old money refers to everything it owns. Without description, without boasting, because description is for people who need to convince you of something. The main house had 14 rooms. There was a guest cottage that slept 8. There was a pool house that had never, in Zola's memory, been used for swimming. The lawns were the particular shade of green that exists only when a team of people tend it every week, from April through October, while the family is somewhere else entirely. Sterling had grown up on this property. He had learned to ride a bicycle on the eastern path that ran along the stone wall. He had kissed his first girlfriend in the pool house. He had graduated from Exeter and then from Yale Law, which his father and grandfather had also attended, their portraits hanging in the library with the particular solemnity of men who believed that what they had built would last forever. Zola had grown up in Gary, Indiana, in a 2-bedroom house that her mother rented for $640 a month, and which had a kitchen faucet that leaked from October to March every year because the landlord never fixed it, and her mother never made enough noise about it. Zola had learned to sleep through the sound of it dripping. She had learned a great many things about endurance in that house. She had met Sterling at a conference in San Francisco. In the spring of the year she turned 31. He had been there representing his firm. She had been there as a speaker. He had come to her panel and asked a question afterward, and she had answered it. And then he had found her at the reception and said, "You were the only person in that room who actually said something." She had laughed, because it was a good line and because he meant it, which was rarer than the line itself. They were married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in Napa that Sterling's parents attended but did not plan. Vivian Ashford had wanted the wedding at the Westport property, with a guest list of 400. Zola had wanted something else. It was the first disagreement, and it was not, it turned out, the last. The reunions happened every summer. Ashford family gatherings, cousins and aunts and uncles and old friends of the family who had been attending for so long that the distinction between family and not family had long since dissolved. They lasted a weekend, Friday evening through Sunday afternoon, and they were organized with the kind of precision that Zola associated with military operations. Because Vivian Ashford had a gift for logistics and a deep investment in appearances, and she applied both to everything she touched. Zola had attended 9 of them. In the first year, she had been positioned in the family photographs somewhere between Sterling's Aunt Constance. Not on the list, Zola corrected herself. Not that Constance. A different Constance. A different family. And a second cousin whose name she never successfully learned, and she had smiled for the camera with the genuine belief that this was a beginning. That she was being included. That the year of cool dinners and polite silences, and the particular way Vivian said her name, with a slight pause before it, as if she were looking it up, was simply the adjustment period. The warming up. In the second year, the photographer had rearranged the group twice, and Zola had drifted, somehow, to the outer edge. She was in the photograph. Her shoulder was in the photograph. In the third year, she was not in the main family portrait at all. When she mentioned it to Sterling that night, he had said, "You were probably in the bathroom, sweetheart. Mom would never." She had not said anything else about it. The comments about her hair began in the 4th year. Vivian's sister, a woman named Agatha, who wore the kind of jewelry that announced itself when she entered a room, had leaned across the appetizer course and said to Zola, conversationally, as though discussing the weather, "Don't you find it tiring, all that maintenance? I've always thought natural hair must be so much work." And then she had moved on to something else entirely, and no one at the table had said a word, and Zola had sat with the comment inside her chest for the rest of the evening, turning it over, feeling its edges. She was a meticulous woman. She did not make scenes. She had been told, beginning in grade school and continuing without interruption through her adult life, that she was intimidating when she was direct, aggressive when she was confident, difficult when she had an opinion, and ungrateful when she did not perform happiness convincingly enough. She had learned to perform happiness convincingly. She had learned to swallow things that should not be swallowed. She had made herself smaller, again and again, in rooms that did not deserve the effort. She told herself it was for Sterling. She told herself that Sterling was worth it. She told herself that things would change. Things did not change. By the 7th year, Zola had begun to notice the specific way in which certain members of the Ashford family failed to direct questions to her. They would ask Sterling, who was sitting right next to her, about things that she would obviously know. They would ask him what she did for work, as though she were not present. They would ask him what she thought about the news, about the economy, about the developments in the tech sector, as though her thoughts required translation, and he was the only one licensed to translate. She had, by this point, been the founder and CEO of a company she had built from a room in her Gary apartment when she was 24 years old. The company, which made supply chain software that she had developed herself, had grown from 3 employees to 400. It had been acquired 4 years ago for a number that caused the business press to run articles with words like remarkable and unprecedented and self-made, which was a word people used when they wanted to acknowledge that you had done something without the advantages they had assumed were necessary to do it. She had taken the acquisition money and invested it, and she had started a second company, and that company was now worth more than the first one had been when it sold. She had been named to various lists. She had been profiled in various publications. She sat on the boards of 2 hospitals and a university she had actually attended, on a scholarship, working 20 hours a week through all 4 years. The Ashford family mostly didn't ask. Sterling's brother, a man named Whitfield, whom she had privately named the commentator, because he had a habit of narrating situations after they had already occurred, had said at the 8th reunion, while they were waiting for dinner, "I read something about your little company. Sold it for a lot, didn't you? Good for you." He had said little company the way someone says bless your heart, with warmth manufactured so carefully that you couldn't quite call it what it was without sounding unreasonable. She had smiled. She had said thank you. She had excused herself and gone to stand on the east porch for 7 minutes and look at the lawn and breathe until her hands unclenched. When she came back inside, nobody had noticed she was gone. The 9th reunion began on a Friday in late July. The weather was what the Ashford family would call perfect, meaning dry and warm and cooperating. The tables on the terrace had been dressed in white linen. There were cocktails at 6, dinner at 8, and a loose Saturday schedule that involved tennis and sailing, and a lunch that Vivian planned but described as casual. Zola had worn a dress she had bought in Paris, which was a fact she mentioned to no one because she had learned that mentioning things like that to this particular group of people produced responses she did not have the energy to navigate. Sterling had squeezed her hand in the car on the way up. "This year will be different," he had said. He said this every year. The cocktail hour was fine. Zola moved through it the way she moved through most things in this house, efficiently, attentively, with a part of herself held back and protected. She spoke to Sterling's cousin Renata about the drive up from the city. She spoke to an older uncle about a book they had both recently read. She accepted a glass of wine and did not finish it. Dinner was when things changed. They were seated 14 at the main table. The seating arrangements, which Vivian produced on a printed card for each place, had put Zola between Sterling's aunt Marguerite, a pleasant, absent woman who spent most of the meal talking to the person on her other side, and a family friend named Roland Fitch, who was a circuit court judge, and who had the manner of a man who believed that his presence in any room constituted a form of endorsement. Vivian was at the head of the table. Sterling's father, Hugh Ashford, was at the other end. The table filled in between them with the assembled weight of the Ashford family's self-regard. The first course arrived. The conversation moved, as it always did, along tracks that had been laid long before Zola arrived. Summer plans, property values in Westport, the performance of certain funds, the weddings and graduations of people Zola mostly didn't know. She listened, she ate, she said appropriate things when addressed, and did not attempt to insert herself into conversations that had not made space for her. She realized somewhere around the second course, stopped expecting space to be made. It was Whitfield who started it. He was sitting across the table, and he had been drinking since the cocktail hour, which was not unusual, and he had that particular looseness around the jaw that came with it. He was talking to the man next to him, a hedge fund manager named Greg, and his voice was loud enough to carry. She does something with computers, right? Software, something. I'm never sure exactly what. He was talking about Zola. He was talking about Zola while she was sitting across the table. Sterling, Whitfield continued, pivoting to his brother without looking at Zola, remind me what it is she does again. I can never keep it straight. Sterling opened his mouth. Zola put down her fork. I'm right here, Whitfield, she said. Her voice was very calm. It was the voice she used in board meetings when someone said something that required correction delivered without drama. You could ask me. Whitfield looked at her. Then he laughed. Not the laugh of a man who found something funny, but the laugh of a man who found something slightly tiresome. Zola, I'm asking Sterling because he explains things in a way that makes sense to me. No offense. No offense. The table had shifted its attention. 14 people, or close to it, were now watching this exchange with varying degrees of interest and varying degrees of willingness to intervene. Roland Fitch, the circuit court judge, had set down his wine glass and appeared to be studying the flower arrangement. Vivian Ashford, at the head of the table, had acquired a particular expression, a slight flattening of the features, a careful neutrality, that Zola had come to recognize as her preferred posture when she wished to be near something without being responsible for it. I build companies, Zola said, directly, to Whitfield. I have built two. The first one I sold for $2.3 billion. The second one is currently valued at approximately $4. I have a staff of 640 people and offices in 7 cities. That is what I do, in a way that makes sense. The table was quiet. Whitfield's expression moved through several phases. Then he settled on amusement. The indulgent amusement of a man who has decided that a woman being direct is charming, in the way that a dog performing a trick is charming. Well, he said, good for you. It was the same phrase he had used the year before, delivered the same way. And then Sterling, who had squeezed her hand in the car, Sterling who said this year would be different, put his hand on the table near hers and said, quietly, the words she had not expected, the words she would not, later, be able to fully explain or forgive. Let it go, Zola. Not here. Not here. As though here were a place that had the right to decide what she was allowed to say about her own life. She picked up her wine glass. Her hand was shaking slightly. She set it back down. That was when it happened. Whitfield leaned across the table. She wasn't sure later what his intention was, whether he meant to gesture, to reach for the bread, to do something that in his mind was benign. What she knew was that his hand moved toward her, and it connected with her shoulder, and it was not gentle. And in the motion something happened that sent the wine glass. Her wine glass, the one she had just put down, off the edge of the table. The silence that followed was not the kind that happens in rooms where nothing has occurred. It was the kind that happens when everyone in the room is deciding what they saw. Zola did not move. She was very still. Whitfield said, "God, Zola, watch what you're." He stopped, not because of the glass, not because of her stillness. He stopped because one of the servers, a young woman who had been moving quietly around the perimeter of the room for the last hour, had stopped by the wall-mounted television in the corner of the adjoining sitting room, which was visible through the open double doors. And the television, which had been muted and running a news ticker in the background all evening, had just switched to a live segment. The anchor on screen was a black woman in a dark blazer. She was mid-sentence. Her voice, when the server's elbow caught the volume button, came into the room clearly, fully, and at full authority. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking. Asgrove Capital under federal investigation. Analysis with Zola Beckett Price, founder and CEO, Price Ventures." And then the camera cut to the studio guest, seated across from the anchor, speaking with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. The woman on the screen was Zola. Not a file photo, not an archival clip. Live, recorded 30 minutes ago, which the lower right timestamp confirmed, for a segment that was airing now. The Zola on screen was speaking about a federal investigation into a company whose fund structures bore a structural resemblance to certain investment vehicles that several people at this table had personal exposure to. She was speaking with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years learning the difference between knowing something and proving it. She was speaking specifically about the kind of due diligence that sophisticated investors were now being asked to answer for. The Zola at the table said nothing. 14 people sat with that. Roland Fitch, the circuit court judge, had gone very still. He had picked up his wine glass. He appeared to be reconsidering several things at once. Vivian Ashford's particular expression of careful neutrality had dissolved into something that she had not, perhaps, intended for the table to see. Whitfield was looking at his plate. Sterling was looking at Zola. She did not look back at him. She was watching the television. She watched herself finish the segment, thank the anchor, and say the name of her company clearly, with the ease of a woman who had earned the right to say it in any room, including this one. Then she folded her napkin. She placed it on the table beside her untouched entree. She pushed back her chair. She stood up. She did not make a speech. She had never needed speeches. What she had needed, for 11 years, was for someone at this table to simply see her, and they had not been willing to do it until the television did it for them. And she was tired, deeply, specifically, in the way that only comes from having carried something too long, of needing to be ratified. She walked to the doorway. She stopped. She looked back once at the table, at the 14 faces that were watching her go, at Sterling, who had not stood up. "Good for me," she said, and then she walked out. Her friend Dee Dee was waiting in the guest cottage, where Zola had asked her to be, 3 hours earlier, in a text message that said, "Can you come? Just in case." Dee Dee, who had known Zola for 22 years, had driven 2 hours without asking why, and had brought wine and hadn't mentioned it. She didn't say anything when Zola came through the door. She just handed her a glass and moved over on the couch. They sat for a while without talking. "How bad?" Dee Dee asked finally. "Moderate," Zola said. Then, "He didn't stand up." Dee Dee didn't say anything to that. She didn't have to. Outside, the property was quiet. The lights from the main house were visible across the lawn, warm and golden through the trees. Somewhere in that light, 14 people were finishing a dinner that had been interrupted, and having conversations she would never hear about a woman they had underestimated for 9 years running. She thought about the girl in Gary, who had learned to sleep through a dripping faucet. She thought about the woman who had built something from that girl's ambition, and that girl's stubbornness, and that girl's absolute refusal to accept that a leaking faucet was simply the condition of existence. She thought about how long she had asked this family to see her. She thought, not anymore. The legal situation involving Roland Fitch and his involvement in Ashgrove Capital became public knowledge 3 weeks later. The federal investigation that Zola had analyzed on camera was broader than the initial reports suggested. 2 members of the Ashford family's investment syndicate were named in a civil complaint that fall. Sterling called her 17 times in the 2 weeks after the reunion. She answered 3 of those calls. The conversations were short and, in their shortness, clarifying. In November, Price Ventures announced a Series B round that valued the company at $6.2 billion. It was covered extensively. The coverage uniformly described Zola as the company's founder, its CEO, and the architect of its growth from a single product into a platform used by 40,000 businesses across 3 continents. None of the coverage mentioned the Ashford family. The Ashford family mentioned Zola. At Thanksgiving, which Zola did not attend, Vivian Ashford reportedly spent a portion of the dinner explaining to her assembled relatives that she had always believed in Zola's potential, that she had from the beginning seen what Sterling had seen. That family is complicated, but that she had never, not once, failed to respect what Zola had accomplished. Nobody at the table, by various accounts, said a word. Which was, Zola thought, when she heard about it, the most Ashford thing that had ever happened. She bought a house in the fall, not a compound, not a property. A house in a neighborhood in Atlanta where she had spent a summer at 14, staying with a cousin, learning that there were Black communities in America where success was not a surprise, and ambition was not an anomaly, and a girl from Gary could look around and see herself reflected back in 100 different faces, 100 different versions of what was possible. The house had a porch that faced west. The sunsets were remarkable. She sat on that porch in the evenings, sometimes with Dee Dee, sometimes alone, and she thought about what it had cost her to stay in rooms that required her to be smaller than she was. She thought about what she had given those rooms. She thought about what she was going to do with what she had left. She had quite a lot left. The faucet in her new kitchen worked perfectly. She checked it the first morning. She stood at the sink and ran the water, and turned it off and stood there in the silence, in her own house, in the city she had chosen, and felt the specific, irreplaceable weight of a life built entirely on her own terms. She had not waited for anyone to validate it. She did not intend to start.